Hello, hello. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. I hope everybody who's connected online can hear me fine. I guess so. You are in control of that. So I trust you for that. And I hope the sound is fine as well, unlike last time when some people said to me that the mic wasn't working properly. So just let me know if there's any issues with that. Okay, so thanks for coming and thanks for listening to this presentation. It is indeed, as you can see from the title slide, a presentation on Malaysia. Malaysia, history, politics, and society. Well, first of all, I should say that I went there to Malaysia in 2017. I was 2 months and a half there, and I think it's a very, very interesting country. It's very interesting politically and culturally and socially, and I think that's why it's worth making a presentation on it. And I mean, the objective of this is ultimately that by the end of it, you have some background on the country and that you hopefully find it as interesting as I do. And by the way, here on the title slide, we can see the Jalur Gemilang, which is the flag of the Federation of Malaysia, which has 14 stripes and 14 points to the star. You can see the yellow star, 14, which represents the number of territories of the Federation. So if we move on to the first slide, just to know where we are. So here we can see the map. Malaysia is the purple one, not the round one, which is Cambodia, but at the bottom, the one that has the peninsula. So it has two parts, as you can see, the peninsula of Malaya. So the old British colony of Malaya, that's the peninsula there in purple. And then opposite to the east, there's on the island of Borneo, there's another part of Malaysia, the north part of the island, which is also purple. And these two parts together form the Federation of Malaysia. Now, it's in the area of Southeast Asia, which is, as you can see, south of China. It's, also ASEAN is there, is the institution, much like the EU, in Southeast Asia, which comprises 10 states. Malaysia is one of them. You can see Thailand to the north and Indonesia to the south. So that's where it is. And the capital is Kuala Lumpur, KL for short. And so if we move on to the next one. Okay, so going into the substance now. So what is the key element for us to understand the country itself and the context in which its history and politics has developed? It's the racial groups of Malaysia. That's the key factor. And you'll understand why very quickly. So as you can see from the pie chart there, and by the way, let me say that race, the concept of race in Malaysia is not like the concept we use here in the West, which is more, of a kind of, it defines more, genetic characteristics and so on. Race in Malaysia, the term is used to denote specific groups in the community, which are not only maybe genetic, but more importantly, linguistic, cultural, and religious. So it is really, used to denote the main groups. And as you can see from the pie chart, the main group is the Malay race, so the Malay people, which forms 55%. We will go into the different races now in a second in more detail, but you can see there, so Malay 55%. The other Bumiputra, so Bumiputra is a term used to encapsulate Malay plus number of tribes and Aboriginal peoples of Malaysia. So that's why both sections are in blue, because legally the term Bumiputra is used in a broader fashion to denote Malays and some other peoples. But the key thing is that Malays are the first group, and then you have Chinese, people of the Chinese race, which are 23%, and people of the Indian race, which are 7%. So generally the three groups, main groups that are considered three racial groups in Malaysia are Malays, Chinese, and Indian. And if we go into a bit more detail about each of them with the next slide, we'll see that the Malays here, we have a picture I've found of a typical happy Malay family there. You see the gentleman wearing the baju Melayu, which is the Malaysian national dress, the baju kurung for the lady, which is the female dress, an older picture of a Malay family as well. So the Malay group, which is the main group again, so they are an Austronesian people, that's the term in terms of genetically. And they have lived in this region of the world for many generations. And, it's the same racial group as Indonesia, for instance. And the language they speak is the Bahasa Melayu. Bahasa in Malay means language. So it's the Malay language, Bahasa Melayu. It's very similar to Indonesian language. In Indonesia, it's called Bahasa Indonesia. In this case, Bahasa Melayu, because it's in Malaysia. So, and their religion is Islam. And basically, Islam was brought from the 11th century onwards by traders who were coming to Malaysia from Arabia and from other parts of the world. And basically, throughout from the 11th to the 14th century or so, Islam became established as the religion of the Malays. And there you can also see I put the dish nasi lemak, which is a typical dish of Malay cuisine. And you can see as well the kris, which is the dagger, the knife, which is a very typical symbol of Malay, this kris. We'll see it in future slides as well. And actually, very importantly, in the constitution of Malaysia, there's a definition of what a Malay is. So that's, I want to make the point that it's not just a term that is used, but it actually has a constitutional definition, which is as follows. It says, Constitution, it says, a Malay is a person who professes the religion of Islam, who habitually speaks the Malay language and conforms to Malay custom. So, it is also a legal term by that measure. And I mentioned there the concept of Bumiputra, which I mentioned before, includes the Malays and other, and the Aboriginal, the tribes that remain in Malaysia, which haven't sort of, become part of wider society. So Malays plus these tribes form the Bumiputra, and Bumiputra means the son of the soil, sons of the soil, so the children of the land, really. So it's this term to denote that these are the sort of the main, the original descendants of the territory of Malaya and Malaysia. If we move on to the next slide, we see Chinese and Indians there. So why are there these two racial groups in Malaysia? So basically, these groups, they are descendants of immigrants who came into Malaysia when it was a British colony. And this was between the early 19th and the mid 20th century. So they came from southern China, in the case of the Chinese, and they came from India as well, Tamil Nadu in India, which is one of the states in India. That's why they speak Tamil, not Hindi. And basically, many of them were escaping so the poverty, maybe especially in China. It was a rural country back then, and they were trying to, find new opportunities in the colony, in the colony of Malaya, British Malaya. There were new tin mines opening. There were rubber plantations and so on. So there was growth in Malaya at that time. So these immigrants came, and of course. What this can mean is only one thing, which is that if you have Malays and Chinese and Indians in such large portions, there are going to be racial tensions. It is bound, it is going to happen, especially because there was this economic process, which is the key really to many of the problems in a way, which is the fact that, so the Chinese race, the Chinese group, many of whom were business men, or starting developing businesses and lived in the urban areas. Or Mr. PowerPoint, okay? Yeah. Okay, sure. No, I was just saying that. So the problem would happen. The process that happened is that the Chinese who were living in urban areas, they started to amass and to have in their hands larger and larger portions of the country's wealth and of the economy. Whereas the Malays, who were the main group, as we saw before, they were left to work the rural lands, to live in the rural areas, to a more agricultural life, basically. Basically, that is the reason why, as we will see, race tensions developed in the country. If we move on to the next slide, one quick note on the politics of the country. Just for you to know, very important general knowledge to have. UMNO is the main party in Malaysia, the United Malays National Organization. So you can see there the flag of the party with the kris. You see in the middle of the flag the dagger, which is the symbol of Malayness. And this is a party, UMNO, which supports Malay nationalism and it's and Islam and conservatism. And it is important because it was the country that had been in power for the longest time in the world in any democracy. So in 2018, I'll do a spoiler, it did lose power eventually in 2018. But in 2018, it was the party in the world in any democracy that had been in power the longest, because it had been in power for 61 years since independence in 1957. And it can help explain why they were in power for so long. On the second bullet point there, you can see Barisan Nasional, the National Front. This is the coalition that integrates UMNO together with two smaller parties, the Malaysian Chinese Association and the Malaysian Indian Congress. So the representatives of Chinese and Indian. So actually, they joined with UMNO to form the ruling coalition, and they ruled for 61 years. Even though it was more a question of giving the Chinese and the Indians some ministry or something, but the UMNO was really, the Malays had the political power in practice. And that's why increasingly over the years, the Chinese and the Indians have been voting for the opposition more and more. If we move to the next slide, and now we will go into the substance of things, which is the history part, which is where everything will come together. Are the slides working? Yes. Very good. So, Merdeka. What does Merdeka mean in the Malay language? Independence. So the independence from Britain. This was, this happened in 1957, on the 31st of August, which is Hari Merdeka, the Independence Day in Malaysia. And there we have good old Tunku Abdul Rahman, who was the first Prime Minister of Malaysia. Great man, in my opinion. And there in the photo, in the center photo, we can see the day of the proclamation of independence, where Tunku Abdul Rahman, he gave his proclamation, his independence speech, and so on. And then he, the new Malaysian flag was raised on the pole, and the British flag was lowered, and and he exclaimed Merdeka 7 times to the crowd, and the crowd chanted with him, Merdeka, independence. So 2 things to note. Interestingly enough, when the Constitution entered into force in 1957, 2 points that are quite interesting. So first, regarding the place of Islam. So as you know, the Malays were the largest group, they are the largest group, and they are Muslim. So there has been quite a lot of debate as to the extent to which Malaysia, is, where does it lie on the range from secularism to Islamic State, being an Islamic state. So this is not too clear because it's not a secular country. That's not the case, but it's not an Islamic state either, where religion and politics are totally united. So it's somewhere in between. And interestingly enough, the Constitution says this very ambiguous phrase, which is Article 3. It reads, Islam is the religion of the Federation, but other religions may be practiced in peace and harmony in any part of the Federation. So, when you say Islam is the religion of the Federation, that is a bit ambiguous, because does it mean that it is the largest religion? Does it mean it has any official status? What does it really mean? So there's this ambiguity to it. Although, of course, as I said, it's not a secular state because Islam does have a big role to play in the country. And another interesting point, so in 1957, when the Constitution was adopted, is Article 153, which is very, very famous or infamous in Malaysian politics, because it reads as follows. It says, it shall be the responsibility of the king, Yang di-Pertuan Agong in Malay, to safeguard the special position of the Malays. So, it is basically saying that the Malays, as original inhabitants of Malaysia, or as the main group there, they are entitled to having a special position, and the king must safeguard this. And it goes further than that. It says that Malays must have certain quotas in the civil service, for instance, in the granting of business licenses, in scholarships and university education. So, it tries to secure the position of Malays. And why is this? Well, basically for the reason I mentioned before, that the Chinese were increasingly gaining more economic power over the decades before independence. And therefore, the constitution tried to say, okay, there must be these provisions whereby Malays are protected as the main group. So that's his independence, that's the constitution, some brief comments. If we move on to the next slide on race relations, this is where we see the problems starting to arise. So, so as I said, the independence of Malaysia came about in 1957 from the British Empire. And, there were racial tensions, and the key example of that famous event in Malaysia is 13th May 1969. Now, this was a case basically of racial violence erupting in Kuala Lumpur. You can see some Chinese demonstrations there on the right. So this was racial violence between the Malays and the Chinese that started as maybe as a small thing, but of course, as these things do, it escalates to the point where it is estimated that around 600 people were killed during these riots, mainly Chinese. I remember when I say Chinese or Indians, I don't mean people from China or Malaysia or India. This means already Malaysians who were from the Chinese or Indian race, because their descendants were immigrants. Yeah, so just a note. So because of these riots in 1969, Tunku Abdul Rahman, our friend from the previous slide, he resigned. He gave way to the second Prime Minister of Malaysian democracy, which was Tun Abdul Razak, there at the top in the picture. And he basically implemented the new economic policy in 1971. And what this was, this new economic policy said the following. So it said, what is the problem? So the problem is that there is no national unity. And why is there no national unity? Because different racial groups are segmented along different economic functions. And the Malays are rural, agricultural, the Chinese are urban and engaged in business and so on. And this is not good, because this does not bring about national unity. So what do we do about it? We try to dissociate the Malays from agriculture and try to make them wealthier. And just as a figure that will help illustrate the extent of the problem, in 1970, just for you to see, the Malays owned, you've seen the figure, 55% of the population, that's now, but it must be similar back then. In 1970, they owned, in terms of wealth in the economy and equity in business, they owned 2.4%. 2.4. So the policy's target was to make this 30%. So you see, it tried to raise the wealth of Malays from being 2.4% of the economy to 30% of the economy. So considerable improvements. And around this time, we also have the concept of, Ketuanan Melayu, we can see there, which means Malay supremacy. It's this concept of, the Malays as the original, people of the land. They must be preeminent in society and in the country, compared to other races. And similar to this concept, we have a very, very famous book that is very interesting read, because it's a it's very opinionated book, but it basically informed it was a building block in a way. That philosophy, it was a building block of Malaysian policy for many years, and it still is. The Malay Dilemma, written by Mahathir Mohamad. The Malay Dilemma, said the following: said if it's the dilemma whereby if the Malays are the original inhabitants of the land, how come they have been losing economically to the Chinese? So what Mahathir said in the book. So, for instance, there's this quote here I read for you: "The Malays are the original or indigenous people of Malaya, and the only people who can claim Malaya as their one and only country." And so Mahathir was arguing to put economic measures that could correct this, Malay Chinese, like the Chinese hegemony in the economy, and in business. And he said, another quote that I have here in the book: "The Malay cannot even call Malaya his land. He is now a different person, a Malay Malaysian, whose authority in his own land is now only shared with others, not only shared with others, but it's shared unequally." So this was what Mahathir was saying, and basically was considered quite it was considered as a potential source of racial tension. So actually, the book was banned in Malaysia back then. And Mahathir was a politician from UMNO, the ruling party of Tunku Abdul Rahman and Tun Abdul Razak, and he was expelled from the party actually because his views were seen as being too uh, radical. And as we can see on the next slide, who became prime minister 10 years later? Well, it was himself. Mahathir, he became the prime minister in 1981, and he ruled for 22 years. Yeah, so that tells you something about it. He won 5 consecutive elections. And during his time, that's when Malaysia industrialized, and when prosperity increased in the country. You can see there the Petronas Towers, which are a landmark of Kuala Lumpur. Once they were the tallest building in the world, and they were built during Mahathir's time. And he reduced tariffs, he privatized, but he also ruled with an authoritarian rule. And he basically, jailed opposition, put opposition politicians in jail, without a trial, and he sacked judges that did not agree with him. He even sacked the presidents of the Supreme Court. So, not good by way of democracy, but that was Mahathir. And if we go into the last slide, UMNO's rule continued for these 61 years, from Tunku Abdul Rahman through Mahathir up to 2018. And Najib, which I don't know if you can see, it's a small picture on the top right of the slide, but it's fine. Najib Razak, he was the prime minister from 2009, and he was very unpopular because he was embroiled in corruption cases. And UMNO, the party, was terribly embroiled in a massive corruption case, especially the one called the 1MDB, which has been considered one of the greatest corruption cases in the world, in history. And what happened was, in 2018, there was a general election, and UMNO lost power. And I remember very well because I was in university at that time and I was following things very closely. And back then it seemed as if it was impossible that UMNO could lose power. They had been 61 years in power. I remember going to Malaysia in 2017 and saying to my friends, making this comment of, at some point, UMNO will lose power because this cannot go on forever. Nothing lasts forever. And it was considered to be something that was totally impossible, that this couldn't happen. Well, 1 year later, it did happen, actually. And UMNO lost to Pakatan Harapan, the Pact of Hope. This was the coalition. And it was basically made up of 4 parties, which, if you're following the Hungarian situation, it's very similar, whereby, all of the opposition unites in a way to, even though they are ideologically different parties, but as you can see there, the 4 parties at the bottom, the symbols, you can see PKR, which is for all Malaysians. The second one is PVM is a Malay party. The third one is a Chinese party, the AP. And the last one, Amanah, is a Islamic party. So they all united to defeat UMNO and the Barisan National Coalition. And and there you can see the picture of the crowd celebrating, with the PKR flag on the day of 9th May 2018. But just as a note, who was the prime minister? Who you think was the candidate of Pakatan Harapan? If we click, we'll see that. If we click, please. Yes, thank you. Our good old friend Mahathir, who had been prime minister for 22 years under UMNO, and who had written the Malay Dilemma once back in 1970. He left UMNO and he came back under the Pakatan Harapan coalition, and he, at 92 years of age, he defeated UMNO, his former party, and he became the prime minister yet again. Nonetheless, on a final note, it was a short-lived government. It lasted for 2 years especially because of internal infighting, especially between the Malay party and the Chinese party within the coalition. So the old racial tensions coming back yet again in politics, in Malaysian politics. So actually, after 2 years, Mahathir resigned, and there's still an ongoing political crisis in Malaysia, in the sense that now UMNO is back, but with a coalition of various parties. But we can at least merit this event and this coalition with breaking the status quo and breaking the political system that had, ruled Malaysia for 61 years. So at least that's something. And moving on to the very final slide, I will say terima kasih to everybody, which means thank you in Malay. So thanks for listening, and I hope you found it interesting. Thank you.